Hey, mental workers. Early career psychs require a lot of supervision. Whether you're doing a master's, registrar program, 4+2 or 5+1, there is a lot of compulsory supervision. And along with that, a lot of anxiety. How do I select a supervisor? What if I don't get along with my supervisor? What if my supervision turns into one of those horror stories? How do I even use supervision effectively? Today, we're going to answer some of those questions with a specific focus on how to get the most out of supervision. And here to join us and provide their personal and professional insights is Annie Slater. Hey, Annie.
Hey, Bronwyn.
Annie is a very accomplished psychologist, and they mentioned to me that they have a lot of imposter syndrome, but I'm just going to lean into that and introduce them really well. So they're a director, board-approved clinical supervisor and psychologist. They work in their own private practice, and they also manage something called the Provisional Psych Network, which provides a stack of supervision and training. And I'll provide the links to that in the show notes. So thank you so much, Annie, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You've been a supervisor for a while now, haven't you?
Yeah, I have actually. I don't know exactly, but
in the long ago.
It out. Yes, we will call it that. Yes.
So, Annie, the first thing I want to start us off with is if you could just tell us what you've seen in supervisors and supervisees around how to use the supervision space. Is this a problem? Like, do they generally find it easy, hard?
I think it can really vary. I think I wish, and I'm actually considering doing this as part of our network, of doing almost like an intro to what is supervision and what it is, what it isn't, how to navigate it. Because I think if a lot of the time, and I know this even for myself, having gone through the 4+2 and now I'm doing the registrar program, is you don't get taught about what supervision is, and you just kind of land in it. And I think that if we had a better understanding of what it was, and especially now having been trained in supervision and providing a lot of it, a lot of supervisees coming to supervision, especially for the first time. Like I remember the first time I went to see my supervisor as an early 4+2 and how anxiety provoking that was, and not even understanding what the purpose of supervision was. I really get that can be tricky. So I think sometimes there is some difficulties people face in understanding how to use the space effectively and what it actually is and isn't.
It's a really good point, because I remember similarly, like when I did my 5+1, you get the outline of what you're supposed to do, and it will be like 300 placement hours. You need 1 hour of supervision every day, but it doesn't explain why you need that supervision. It was just like a thing that you do, and I have to talk to this person. I have no idea why. I have no idea how to use it. What is my purpose? Just a lot of existential questions coming up, I guess. But you just do it. And then I feel like everybody just pretends that they know what this is, and we're all just in this shared delusion.
Oh, and adding to that, even just, all the tricky parts about early career, navigating your first therapy session and how anxiety provoking it is, and all the imposter syndrome that goes along with it. It is a lot. And, if you have a really good supervisor, they're usually quite good at naming that and helping you through it and understanding what it is and isn't through a supervision contract. And I think that's really important for supervisees, so they do that, and I think we've all had experiences of good and helpful supervision versus less maybe effective supervision. And, that can be on both sides of the fence for the supervisee or supervisor. So hopefully we can cover a bit more about that today.
Yeah, totally. So let's jump into the dilemma that was presented to us today. So I got a message from a listener, and here's what they said. They said, I'm doing my 4+2 and I've had pretty good supervisors so far, I think. There are so many provisional horror stories on supervisors, and I would really love to hear some more in-depth stuff about what the ideal supervisory relationship looks like on a day-to-day / week-to-week basis. Smiley face.
I love that. I love it. And we have heard horror stories, and a lot of us have had horror stories, and that's why in my supervision contract, I actually have a section where we talk about it. Like, what were your previous experiences of supervision? What was helpful, unhelpful? Because I want to know that as a supervisor.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, because, it really can affect getting some good feedback on how you can improve this supervision relationship. But I think that's a very common thing for people to have heard, especially on the forums and things. You see some of the worst things. and managing kind of a supervision business, I've navigated those things even just from this side operationally, and it's tricky. Supervisees are really vulnerable. So I really get, how do they know when to change supervisors is probably, the really broad question there.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, and let's start off with, Annie, paint us a utopia. What would an ideal supervisory relationship look like day to day, week to week? And I guess it would involve, in answering this question, like, what is each party's role in supervision, right?
Yeah. And I think I love that utopia. And I think we have to have some not unrelenting standards of what supervision should be, because, no one is perfect. There is no such thing as a perfect supervisor or a perfect supervisee. You're all going to screw up at different points in the relationship. And part of being a good relationship is that you can repair that and move forward. But when I think about what, the ideal supervisor was, I always think about this one supervisor I had, and I had them during my 4+2. And the reason that they were ideal was that they not only had a really good grasp of what I had to do for that pathway. So they understood what I would look like as a psychologist when I came out the other end, and kind of knew how to guide me there. But they were much more structured in supervision. They helped identify when we were not having effective conversations in supervision that were leading to improved client outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit about what she used to do, because I've just mirrored her. I've probably just taken on a lot of her skills, but also it's safe. Like I would say that a good supervision relationship is you can be vulnerable. The person creates a space in the same way we would create the space for a client that is safe, that feels psychologically safe. I can share with them if I have no idea what I'm doing, that we collaborate, that it's a team effort, that I'm given some choice where possible in what we talk about and how we get there, that it's collaborative, and also that they empower you, right? Because I think early in your supervision kind of journey, there's this developmental model of supervision, right? And it's when we're newer, we need much more guidance, and supervision becomes much more directive in answering questions because you don't know. There's this whole bunch of information that you don't know yet. And then on the other hand, as you kind of walk through that level of competence, you have all that knowledge and it becomes a bit more reflective. So I think even just understanding where that is and having a good supervisor that can really respond to you where you are and check and clarify that your need got met in supervision that day and was anything outstanding. Yeah, I think that's what resonates. I think the utopia is that you leave supervision with some knowledge and where to go next is probably, or feeling heard and validated if there was things about some tricky things that came up in your sessions with your client that also maybe affected you, that it felt safe, is probably my summary of what I think an effective supervisory relationship looks like.
And is that realistic? When I hear you say all these things, I'm like, whew, that sounds like a tall order. I'm not a supervisor, but I would get some anxiety being I have to do all these things.
Well, I think, we, as a supervisor, we always want to be reflecting on our supervision the same way we do with therapy. How do I improve? How do I get better in this space? Your supervisor does not know everything. No supervisor exists out there that can answer every question that you have. But you should have a supervisor that's humble and ethical enough to say, hey, that's a great question. I don't know this answer either. How can we find out the answer to this question? Or where can we find some resources? Or who's the ninja in this space that we could connect to? Where's some literature on this? What would be a task that we could do to kind of, skill up? What professional development do we need to look at? It's in some ways the supervision relationship, whilst it has these extra responsibilities that make it a little bit more tricky to navigate around ethics and the supervisor being, responsible for that supervisee's practice when they're in their internship parts. Yeah, I think it is. I had some really great supervision. over the course of, and I've had a lot of supervision, having done the 4+2 and now doing that, and now finishing all my placements and then going into the registrar program. And it looks different. What my supervision now looks very different to when I was a 4+2. Very, very different.
And is that reflecting, I guess, your increased competence and your needs?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And having a supervisor that, can check and like work out, like we're going to, because, to be really honest, now that I've gone into my placements, it did become a little bit more tricky thinking about like and it was a lot of supervision. I just finished all my placements for my master's.
Congratulations.
And I had to do an hour a day of supervision. And it's for someone who's relatively experienced and has got all the core counseling skills and has like done a lot of therapeutic modalities. I had some tricky, and I had to keep asking myself, like, how can I make this space helpful? What can I, because you never stop learning. And my supervisor was so skilled in some therapies that I wasn't trained in yet. And so what we did was we found some ways for me to be able to do some learning in between sessions so that I was getting some skills out of that supervision where it just didn't become about talking about cases that I was already pretty certain that I knew how to navigate. But it's tricky.
So in that, let me just unpack that because there's a lot in there. So would you consider it the supervisee's role to work out what do I bring to supervision, or is that a joint responsibility, or is that the supervisor's responsibility? So I guess I'm asking you, what is the supervisee's role in supervision?
I would say that it's a team effort across the board. Your supervisor's job is to know what is required for that pathway, to kind of guide you to get to the end point. But as you as the supervisee, you are really the most knowledgeable of where you are in regards to the tasks that need to be completed, the logbooks that have been done, what things came up during the week that like you had no clue about? What ethical problems did you face this week? So I think for me, and I do this with my supervisees, and it's dependent on where they are in that developmental model, it's thinking about like what skills would it's kind of on competence. So what skills would I expect someone, who's really like a green 4+2 who's never even seen a client versus someone who's up here. And what we should be doing is the supervisor's job is to be vulnerable and say, these are the skills maybe I'm missing. The supervisor's job is to work out a plan of how we get there. We collaborate on that. So the day-to-day is we both come with an agenda. Because there'll sometimes be things that I want to talk to my supervisee about. Maybe they sent me a report and there's, maybe I've noticed in the report that we could work on maybe strengths-based language and it's not something that we've brought into the supervision space yet. And I'll have it as like a rough agenda. And then the supervisee will bring theirs. And I think what I really encourage my supervisees to do is to prioritize their agenda. So we will start with the most urgent need, which will always be ethics or risk. And then we will move down to like prioritizing what comes next. And I might not talk about what I need to talk about that day because it's not the biggest priority for the session.
So you have like a shared agenda and you go by priority and need for what needs to be addressed. Annie, what about if you're doing an hour of supervision every day like you and you really don't know how to fill that time? This is actually a problem that I've encountered as well. Sometimes I go to supervision and I'm like, nothing's come up this week. I don't have anything to talk about. We've talked about all my cases. Everything's going pretty smoothly. I don't have any reactions that have come up during the week. How do I fill my time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, I always have backup topics that I'd like to talk to my supervisor. So when I'm picking a supervisor, I really pick them for a reason. I don't just pick anyone. I pick someone who has a skill set maybe that I don't have yet, or knowledge that I don't have yet, or just something that I know that they could give me that maybe some other supervisors couldn't, that I don't have yet. And so what I would do is I would make sure that I was planning out some tasks in therapy that maybe I was getting exposed to some things that were new so that I could take them to supervision. So for example, for my first placement for my master's, I knew as soon as I saw that I had to do an hour of supervision a day, I was like, I will not survive doing that unless I actually have something that I'm actually learning. I will feel sorry for that supervisor and it will just become really dry. And so I chose to learn autism assessment and I picked a supervisor who was in both endorsed in clinical and ed and dev because they were so skilled in that area. And then I picked another one around learning disabilities because it was something I really wanted to learn. So I think it's planning for the fact that you're going to be doing all this supervision and forward thinking of how can I get the most out of it with learning a new skill. You don't even necessarily have to be doing that work to still bring those kind of conversations into supervision. You know, it's really, I found it really effective too. If I'm thinking about my supervisors, is I'll ask them because they're great mentors in whatever area they're really skilled in. Is asking them some really good questions about what steps did you take to get really competent in that area if it's something?
That's a genius question.
Yeah, because it's hard. There's so much out there. That's what I love about psychology. You never get bored. If you're willing to kind of go learn more stuff, then you never get bored because there's so much to learn, right?
Yeah. So if I'm trying to summarize that, I'm thinking how to get the most out of supervision, you really need to know what it is that you want to learn. And if you don't know what you want to learn, that sounds like a conversation that could be brought to your supervisors. You can ask them, what did you do to gain competency in this area? What do you think could be things to learn? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also too, doing some self-reflection. So in most pathways, you have to do a reflective journal or you have like those awful logbooks.
Yeah.
And dreading going into my registrar and having to start doing the logbooks again because I was, they were
You thought they were in the past. Yeah.
I know. We have like so much empathy again. I always had empathy for my supervisors for their logbooks, but yeah, back in the thick of it. But what I would say too is usually I would use my logbook reflections as my agenda. So say, for instance, I'm reflecting on my clients for that week and I'm thinking about like, well, you know, I did do a risk assessment there, but, you know, that was a pretty complex one. I'm pretty confident that I did a really good job of that. Maybe that's a good thing to take to supervision to reflect on my formulation to see if there's anything that my supervisor can add to that or just check my skill set. Role plays are really good if you don't have if you come to supervision, and I did this a few times in my placement where I'd put time aside to plan for my supervision and then it got eaten up for something. And then, like you said, you turn to supervision and you're like, oh no, I didn't prepare for supervision. Is thinking, what role play can we do so I can demonstrate or reflect on skills that maybe I could improve in? Because you can role play so many different things in supervision. And I'll let you in on a little trick. Your supervisor, the best thing that you can get out of supervision is your supervisor role modeling skills, not you role modeling them.
Oh.
So ask your supervisor, get vulnerable and say, this is something I'm feeling a little like it's a skill that I want to develop and it shouldn't be you modeling it first. Ask how do you feel, supervisor, about maybe if you could be the clinician and I be the client and I show you and you can help me see how you would navigate that, because it's a really great way for you to develop some extra skills in how they do it, because they might do it a little bit differently, but it might be something that you can put in your toolkit around language or metaphors or whatever it is that they do that might be a little bit different to you.
That's so amazing. I've literally never done a role play and I've had hundreds of hours of supervision. I've never done one. Yeah, I've never done one in supervision. How do I get that? Do I just say, hey, can we do a role play around this, or can you show me that?
You know what's so funny, Bronwyn, is I do lots of supervision and I'm always the supervisor who's like, hey, how about we do this role? And most of my supervisors are like, no, like we can, let's not do that. And most supervisors want to avoid doing that because it is more anxiety provoking.
But it's so helpful.
Totally. If you're going to mess up, do it in supervision.
Yeah.
Practice in there so that your client gets the benefit of that, because that's what supervision's meant to be. How do you be better at your job? How does the client get the best of you? So
it's a place to practice and be vulnerable.
Yeah. Definitely. And if you can record your sessions, most of us hate recording our sessions as clinicians. I think it's a 100, well, I would say it's probably 100%. People just like cringe. They have to watch themselves back. It comes with all this anxiety. I really encourage people, I still record my sessions. If I have a client that I am really struggling with and I can't work out what the dynamic is, or if I need some insight into the pattern that we're just getting stuck, I'll ask for consent from my client to record it, and I will take it to my supervision because I want some help. It's the best thing that you can do for your clinical work is actually to watch yourself back. You pick up on all your little, the things that you say all the time that are really repetitive, your facial expressions, or it helps you formulate better. So I don't think we should ever stop doing that.
No, I agree. I've had to record my sessions because I'm doing schema therapy accreditation, and it's been so helpful for my supervisor. They've watched them as well, and for them to be like, you see, Bronwyn, when you were really happy here and your client was just suffering over there and you ignored them. And I was like, oh, shit. But it's so helpful so you don't get caught up in your own world because, one time I was just really focused on the agenda and I'm like, hurdy-gurdy, I'm getting through the agenda really well. My client is not doing great. I swear every time I do a video, I learn something dramatically new about myself in my practice.
Yeah, and you have to be willing to be uncomfortable to grow in that space.
Yeah, it's disgusting. I hate looking at it.
Yeah, me too. I just did my EMDR, halfway through my EMDR, and we had to do the same thing. And I love supervision because most of the time you will pick up what you did wrong. And the way I usually do my supervision reflections with my supervisees is we'll watch something, and then the way I structure it is I say, what were your areas of growth? Everyone misses their areas of growth. They spend the whole time looking at the video, looking at all the things that they did wrong that stick out like a sore thumb.
Yes.
And they miss all the things they did well.
Yes.
So I usually try to focus on that, and then I'll add to them because they'll always miss stuff. And then I usually structure it so it's, what are the areas for growth? We all have them. I don't think you could ever watch a therapy session and not say, we could have had maybe this here or that there and improved in some way. And 90% of the time, supervisees will see things that I didn't even notice. That's why watching them back is so important and that's why it's part of every pathway has direct observation where you're meant to have because you can think you're nailing it, but you're not.
Absolutely. Annie, how do you frame that to clients? I'm just curious if you can give us a 1 or 2 liner. So you're stuck with a client, you don't really know what to do. You're thinking, okay, this would be a good candidate to film and bring to supervision. How do you phrase that to the client? Are you just I'm feeling stuck, yo. I just don't know what to do with you.
No, I don't do that. So always in a strengths-based way that it's about you, not the client. So I will usually say to my client, and kind of the narrative would be, hey, Jane, I'm really, really value getting better as a therapist. And part of that is sometimes recording my sessions to take to supervision to look at what I can improve as a therapist for my future clients. And I'm wondering if that would be okay if we record our session, and then obviously doing informed consent. And then we go through, when I'll delete it and whatnot. They really need to understand the purpose of it is not about them. It's really about you being able to navigate your therapy maybe with them in more effective ways. And I think that's the way because that's another thing most supervisees struggle with is getting consent to record their sessions. And I remember doing it I'm feeling so awful that I'm going to ask this person to be we're going to record your most vulnerable discussions in therapy today. And what I say to my supervisees is how you ask the question will dictate whether or not they feel comfortable or not.
100%. Yeah, I had to practice it and now I get almost a 100% yes rate.
Instead of being I was thinking that maybe today you don't have to do it. You don't have to do it.
Yeah. But only if you want to, but you don't have to.
Yeah. And whereas, it's the same thing now. And as long as you've got informed consent, they can say no, then and stop it whenever they want to, then that's fine too. But record your sessions, people.
100%. Such a good thing to bring to supervision. Thank you, Annie. I'll bring us back to something else that I wanted to touch on in this conversation, which is that, look, when you're doing your studies at uni or you're doing your 4+2 or 5+1 or registrar program, sometimes there's a limited pool of supervisors to select from. Sometimes supervisors don't have availability. So essentially you end up with a supervisor who might not be 100% a good fit, but they're the only supervisor that's available. Or in the case at university, you get a supervisor assigned to you, or in placements that happens as well. So my question is, how do you navigate supervision when you don't have a choice necessarily and the supervisor isn't 100% a good fit? Like, what do you do and say to manage this relationship?
Oh, it's such a good question. And it's such a problem. I have really strong feelings that you should have some say in who you choose as your supervisor, and that there should be a whole process in deciding if that supervisor is a good fit for you based on their skill set that you're trying to access, but also how you feel with them in talking with them. So it's a shame if someone doesn't have choice. And as someone who navigates a supervision business, it's quite common sometimes too, where a practice will have like their director, and instead of, outsourcing the supervision where the supervisor could pick, they are the supervisor.
Yeah.
And it creates if anyone's listening who has their practice, don't do that. If you can avoid it, makes there's a conflict there in terms of, the business side of it and supervision.
It's such an obvious conflict as well. But the number of times I hear this happen, and it happened at my workplace when I was a provisional psych, that the director who was, employing them was also acting as a supervisor. So it's cheaper from a business perspective for them, but there's a huge conflict there.
Yeah. It isn't actually more expensive. Like,
do you think?
If you took that session and replaced that session with a client session for the director, that would pay for that supervision session. So I think that's a myth. A lot of the time I think it's just often them, they have good intentions. I want to mentor, I want to be hands-on, I want to help them, I want to see if there's problems. Usually it's driven by good intent. And if it works, it works. But when it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Anyway, but getting back to your question. So if you get a supervisor who isn't maybe 100% a good fit, I think the first thing you have to do is do a bit of journaling about what it is that is coming up in supervision, what's happening in supervision, how are you feeling, what is the reason for why it's not feeling 100% a good fit, because that will dictate how you problem solve it. So if it is a safety issue, like it doesn't feel psychologically safe, is that something of like really reflecting on, is there something the supervisor's doing that's really problematic in the power dynamic that I might actually need some help from my placement coordinator and I might need to get someone, maybe a secondary, and talk to them about how I'm feeling and work that out. And they might be able to support you in how you might be able to give feedback around those sorts of things in supervision. If it's something like they don't have the skill set that I need, that's very problematic. If you're working with kids, and this would not happen, hopefully. And if it does, again, we need to address that and name it in supervision and be empowered to address it, because the clients suffer, and so will your skill set. Is if you work with kids and your supervisor only works with adults, that is not a good fit.
No.
Yeah. Because they're not going to have the skills. So that's why it's like it's important to work out at the commencement of that supervision relationship, what are you going to be doing? What's the work that you're going to be doing so the match is correct, and you can identify these issues early before the supervision starts. Because in most of the cases, so say for instance with the university, if you have a conversation with that supervisor, you might be able to together identify that's not a good fit, and see if you can change and if there's processes for that, because there should be. That's not ethical if it's a fit that's not skills-based.
So if there's not a discussion about what is this supervision and what's it going to involve, and can I bring this as a supervisor to the table, then would you recommend that supervisees bring that up and be like, hey, just wanted to double check what we're doing in supervision?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and how you bring that up. If it's something that can't be changed, if it can't be changed, you need a new supervisor.
Yeah.
So if it is one of those things where you work with kids and they don't, then nothing is going to be helpful in supervision, and that does need to change. Versus something, if there was an issue that you felt that there wasn't enough skill development in supervision, and that's why it wasn't 100% good fit because it's a very specific problem, you could have a conversation with your supervisor in a very task-oriented way about what you want to get out of supervision that would make it even better. Not in what it's not, why is it bad? It's how can it be better? So can we maybe in our future sessions practice X, Y, Z skills? So I think the key to that question is, why isn't it a fit? And who can help me work out why and then resolve that problem?
Yeah, who would you recommend we go to work out if it is a good fit? Because from a supervisee's perspective, I remember not knowing what good supervision looked like. I didn't know whether my supervisor was normal or not. And it's only through reflection and talking through other psychs that I was like, oh, that wasn't actually a good thing. But how do we, because I guess we're just plagued by self-doubt. So we're just like, it must be us. We just inherently trust this person that they know more. How do we know if like the things that we're concerned about are legit things to be concerned about?
Well, what I would say is there's so many different places that you can, pose that question to get some feedback on those things. So usually it's very rare you're just going to have one supervisor. You'll usually have a primary and a secondary. Ask your secondary, go to them and just say, hey, name it. I'm not trying to split you, but I really wanted to get your feedback on this. I'm new to supervision and I just want to have a conversation around some dynamics or some difficulties I'm having in supervision. And I'd love to get your perspective on it. That is a really effective way. Other ways are to talk to colleagues in your workplace. Other places are the forums. So you can put anonymous posts around, hey, da 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 da. Problem up, get some feedback on what they think about that. Because all supervisors are different in terms of like personality, but we should be providing the same reflection and structure and safety in the supervision that's going to make it effective.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. And I guess maybe a recommendation is to, if you reflect and something doesn't seem right, don't sit on it for like a year, get some feedback. Yeah.
Change.
Yeah.
We have a policy in the network where it's like, if you, we support supervisees to change.
Wow, great.
So if they identify that it's not a good fit for them for whatever reason, no questions asked, just change supervisors.
Oh, amazing.
Because, hopefully you've had a conversation and you've reflected on, is this something that we can address in supervision to improve it? And then that's when you make that decision after you've tried to improve it because you've communicated the problem. But don't stay in it. You don't need to. You're wasting a lot of money. Supervision's expensive.
It is really expensive. Yeah. So Annie, just kind of going on a bit of a tangent with this question, but I'm wondering if you can show us how you give feedback to your supervisors. So I guess it requires some bravery. You've reflected, you've been like, okay, like I think this is the problem. Let's say the problem is a skill mismatch. They don't have that child experience and you need that. Could you give me a demo of how I would give that feedback to my supervisor?
Oh, I love this question. So is this specific to a skill when we don't the supervisor doesn't work with kids. I'm working with kids and I'm identifying week after week. Because if you work with kids are tricky. You're going to need help with that.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Yeah. So how would I give that feedback to my supervisor?
Yeah. So I would frame it as an agenda item.
Okay.
So hopefully your supervisor comes in and says, what's on our agenda today? Blah, blah, blah. I would say, I'd really like to talk about a problem I'm having in supervision around getting some support with my child clients. And so then hopefully it's on the agenda for supervision. And then I think you have to be brave and use I statements. So it's not about the supervisor. So, if the supervisor not working with kids is a choice and that choice is fine, it's just they don't have the skills to be able to meet that need. So the way I would frame it was, Bronwyn, I'm just really feeling stuck with some of my child cases. I'm feeling that in supervision, I have these needs around my cases and questions that I have that I feel that I can't have answered in this space because you don't work with children, which I completely understand. I'm wondering how we can problem solve this need that I have in working with my child clients because I'm really concerned about my skills and competence in that area. And then hopefully that will segue into the supervisor being like, This is what your supervisor should do if you ever did come to the party with that conversation. The supervisor should celebrate because you are able to communicate a need effectively. And then the supervisor should say, thanks, that's a great way. That's great that you've identified that. Let's talk about how we do that. Is it me? Do we get you a secondary that works with kids and you see them more regularly? Do we join a group supervision that works with kids? Like helps you problem solve the problem because you've identified the need.
I love that. When you were saying that to me, I was trying to put myself in a supervisor's shoes and I felt like it was a lovely way to communicate it and I didn't feel defensive. And I was like, oh, problem solving. I can problem solve with you. Yeah, definitely. So it made me feel like really invested in trying to help you.
Yeah, because you're inviting them in to help you with the problem. That's what supervision is.
Yeah.
Because if you can identify it, your supervisor should be able to help you get the need met, even if it's not with them.
Okay, can I throw a trickier one at you? And listeners, I am putting Annie on the spot here. But okay, so this is something that happened to me in my early supervision, which was around 70% of my supervision sessions were the supervisor talking about themselves and their experience. And if I have a generous interpretation, I think they were trying to convey and try and help me through their own experiences, but it came across to me as sometimes unrelated, sometimes it was tangential stories, and it would take about 15, 20 minutes of the session for one story, and then I wouldn't get through my agenda items. So to me,
it happens so commonly.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. Well, I'm not glad it happens commonly, but I'm glad that it's something that you've encountered before. So how would I give feedback around this issue, which I saw as like them talking too long about their own personal experiences?
Yeah. And I guess my first question before we jump into that is, what was it about that for you, Bronwyn, that was so ineffective when they shared? Because was there nothing you could take from the narrative?
At times, there was nothing I could take from the narrative. Their clients were actually very different from the client that I was bringing. So I'd bring a client, say, this client's experiencing depression. Maybe they're a 20-year-old cisgendered female, and they would talk about their client who is 70-year-old male. So different presentations, but they thought that there was still connection. So I felt like I couldn't get a clear link between what they were describing to me and how to apply that to my client. And then the story would finish and I would be none the wiser what I was supposed to take away from that.
Okay, that's great. So you kind of listened to this narrative, but there wasn't much to take from it is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Or it wasn't clear what you were meant to take from it, what the purpose of it was?
Yes, exactly.
Great. So what I would do and I have had supervisors who've done this, it's probably more common than you think in supervision. Because what happens when someone talks about their case is this is what your brain does. Your brain goes, I've had that. And as a supervisor, you have to unhook from it because they're different. Not all clients are different, even if the problem seems a little bit the same, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I would do if that was coming up frequently in supervision is, how would I handle it? So what I would do, and this relates to my amazing supervisor who would nip this in the butt. And she would ask me if I went on a massive tangent, what she would say to me. They're related. Hear me out, Bronwyn.
Yeah.
What she would say to me was I can waffle. And I could talk all about the client because I know all the narrative details. Sometimes you don't need all the narrative details. And she would get me much more concise. And she would say, what's your supervision question? Like, why are you telling me? It's like, why are you telling me this? It's pretty much in a nice way. Like, and we got really good at it. And she'd say it and immediately my brain would be like, okay, what's the problem? What do I actually need? And I'd have to think of the answer. In essence, what you're talking about is like the flip, where the supervisor is like talking to you about all the different ways of this case. And I'm trying to think about a way that you would, as a supervisee, frame that. So a gentle way maybe at the outset would be so from what you've told me, what is it that I can take from your client experience that's going to help me with my client? So it's not argumentative, and you might find that then she's able to synthesize it into what she actually was trying to communicate.
Yeah.
But if it kept happening in supervision and you just felt like you were in the sea on the boat getting carried away with the whole narrative and it still wasn't being effective, what I would do is I would put an agenda item on supervision and, again, come back to what would make supervision even better. So what I would say, I'd get brave, because did you have a good relationship with that supervisor?
I felt like I could have brought something up. Yeah, chose not to be brave because I didn't know how to handle it, but I felt like I could have.
Yeah, common. I look back at my supervision experiences during my 4+2, and there's so many things I would have done differently. And a lot of it revolves around communicating more effectively what I needed.
Yeah.
So if anyone can take that from our chat
totally.
today,
Yeah, please do.
take that. because when I did, and now being now I'm registered and I can communicate those needs much more effectively in my supervision. But I wish I'd done it earlier, because my experience has been that when you communicate it effectively, the need gets met. You know, you just have to work out a way to communicate it in a way that's not mean. In the same way you wouldn't want your supervisor to give you feedback about your direct observations that were like, hey, that sucked, you know? Yeah. So what I would say is I would go to the next session. I'd say, hey, Bronwyn, I've been thinking about our supervision, and, you know, I've been really thinking about how we can make this space the most productive it could be. And I've been thinking about the way in which we talk about the cases. And I'm wondering if we can take more of a structured approach to the formulation of my cases in what would be the next point in the treatment plan for my client. So if we could do a formulation maybe collaboratively with my client, and then we talk specifically about what would come next in the treatment plan for that client. And then that way, hopefully, sometimes it's implicit, the supervisor hopefully could hear that maybe wasn't, this is what you're needing moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one way to do it. Or even just naming it. And naming it in a way that's like kind and caring. Bronwyn, I know you have so much clinical practice, and I imagine you have lots of clients over your years of working that, you know, that would be really helpful to share. I just sometimes find in our space that I need more focus on my cases and their formulation and treatment plan, and maybe less talking about your experiences with your client group.
Oh, shit. Oh, my God. That would feel so scary to say.
It would, but you know what? If your supervisor was able to take feedback, was kind and caring, they would be able to think about, okay, well, what is it that Bronwyn needs that I'm not being able to provide? Because the summary of it was, right, tell me if I'm wrong, is that you weren't clear. At the end of this discussion about this case, it just became a narrative rather than like, what did I get out of that narrative? What was the point?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, because you don't want to never hear about your therapist's,
no, I do.
Your supervisor's cases.
Yeah.
Just to get to the point a bit quicker.
Exactly.
Maybe.
Rather than it being a 15-minute story. It's more like a 2 or 3 minute story where we get to the point of what you're trying to convey.
Yeah. And in a safe relationship, you could become an ongoing joke. Like I have one supervisor who used to do it regularly. We actually did have a conversation about it. And then she'd start talking about her cases, and then she'd go, I'm doing it again.
That's so funny.
But we had a really good relationship where we'd go, yeah. What is there to take from this? Is there anything to take from this, or not really?
Or is this just a chummy story?
Yeah.
Okay. No, that sounds really good, Annie. And it brings up for me like the importance of not ignoring it, because I ignored it for ages, and then I'd just be sitting there as a provisional psych, like stressed out of my brain, being like, I have 5 other things to get to, and you're telling me a 20-minute story which you're expecting me to laugh with you throughout, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with this.
Well, because it's not about meeting your need, it's about their need.
Yeah.
And that's not helpful. The other thing I'd say is your supervisor should be at regular intervals, like every 6 months or so, reviewing supervision processes dynamic and getting some feedback on the supervision process and how you're finding it and what could improve it. And if your supervisor is not doing that, it's okay for you to enact that and say, hey, I'm just wondering if in our next session we could have like a discussion around how us both like prepare and think about different ways that we could make this supervision even better moving forward. So it's not negative feedback. It's packaged in a way that it's great. Let's just get it even better. It feels safer. Yeah.
And one thing that just went through my mind just then is that as a provisional psych or an early career psych, I actually felt quite scared of supervisors. I guess they're such an experienced, powerful position. But then hearing you speak about it, it really reinforces to me how much of a collaborative relationship supervision should be.
Yeah. And if it doesn't feel that way, then get a new supervisor.
Yeah.
But to be fair, it's the supervisor's job to manage the power dynamic, not the supervisees. So, but it is, your supervisor's not a mind reader. They can't tell if there's a problem unless, well, they should, some things they should know is a problem. But especially if you've brought things, the immediate response should be, tell me more about that. Let's problem solve that. How do we fix that? How do we make that better for next session? It is hard though.
It is, but I think like even practicing that with your peers and getting some lines that you can say or writing it out and then practicing it can really help boost your confidence in being able to bring that to supervision.
Yeah, and two, as well, I don't know how much you know about feedback-informed treatment.
I do.
Yes, very important.
Yes.
For those listeners, go and do training in feedback-informed treatment because it will really help you understand, one, how you can seek feedback from your clients to improve your practice as a developing psychologist, but two, how you can then give feedback to your supervisor in a way that's safe and kind.
Yeah, no, I need to do an episode on that coming up. It's just so much other stuff, Annie. But yeah, it's such an important thing. And I really feel like working out how to give feedback is like an essential competency for psychologists.
Yeah.
Annie, I think we're coming up towards the end of the episode, but I wanted to check with you. Is there any other hints, tips, hacks you can give to our listeners on how to get the most out of supervision?
Oh, yeah. I think that asking yourself what your supervision question is really important. I think picking your supervisor is really important. Don't go through a process of thinking, what's the work I'm going to be doing? What skills might I need? And then interview your supervisor. And don't be afraid if it's not a good fit when you meet them and it just doesn't feel like you clicked, to then pick someone else. That is okay. Not all supervisors are going to be good fit for supervisees. That is okay. You're going to be spending a lot of time with them. So make sure it is a good fit and change sooner rather than later, like you said.
Yeah.
But I think too, the biggest thing I would say is being vulnerable in supervision. It can be really hard. That imposter syndrome is really tricky for early career psychs. But if you're not able to be vulnerable and share your needs, you're not going to get them met. And you can pretend like you're doing it all and you know all the things. And that is, you're going to come at the end of your internship, just the imposter syndrome will be rife because you didn't get to check all the things along the way because you weren't vulnerable to be able to say, I don't feel good doing that. I still don't really think I've nailed behavioral experiments. Whatever it is.
Yeah, no, it's such an important skill and something that I'm only really learning like 3 years post-registration, but really seeing the value in it. Literally, I had supervision yesterday and I said something along the lines to my supervisor. When you said X, I felt judged, and that hurt me a little. And then we talked about that. And it was really hard conversation, but it was such a good one. So yeah, highly recommend.
Love it. And if the response isn't safe, get a new supervisor.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
But that's really hard to say. But, in early career psych, we're a lot of times learning how to be assertive, or we're starting to learn into personal effectiveness. Those skills develop as you go, and we're usually more self-sacrificing psychologists.
Yeah, we are.
And then as we get along in our career, we realize, that's not helpful.
Why am I burning out every 2 weeks? Is it because I'm bending over backwards for everyone else?
What are those unrelenting standards? And how do I put them aside? But you just gave a really good example of what you need to be able to do in supervision, because I, as someone who navigates our whole network, sometimes supervisees will give me a call because there is something, they're struggling with in supervision. And my job is often to empower them to take it back to supervision. And we have yet to have a problem where they've taken it back and it wasn't received in a way that was supportive and problem solved.
Oh, so good to know.
So, win for our team.
Amazing.
But I guess I'd say that to everyone listening is that you need to test that hypothesis, because are we doing some cognitive distortions around what we think will happen and fortune telling and catastrophizing? Thank you, Bronwyn. Yeah. So I would say that's probably a lot of it. I don't know. Do you have anything to add, Bronwyn? You've had a lot of supervision too.
Yeah. No, I think what you've pointed out has been extremely helpful, and I'm sure our listeners will find it really helpful to implement. I think it's really important to be brave and give feedback, and then to know that, if you don't receive a validating, helpful response, that isn't your fault. That's actually something that perhaps needs to be worked out, or perhaps change supervisors. Because, I feel like early career psychs, we do have a lot of that self-doubt automatically, and we're like, oh, I failed, I did something wrong. But sometimes it's just not a good fit. And that's preventing you from getting the most out of supervision that you can.
And I think that's probably one other thing just to add on the end is if you have to change supervisors, it's okay.
Yeah, it's not no biggie.
No, most supervisees, I was lucky actually. I went through my whole one with the same 3, but it's very rare. I'm finding most of the time people will change and chop. I added heaps of secondaries just for their skill sets. I was like, oh, I'm going to add you. Oh, that's nice. But having that conversation about the change, it's the same thing. It's about I statements. I have realized that I think I've got what I needed from our supervision, and I'm really looking for someone in this area. Whatever the reason is that you've shifted, that is okay. That is a valid reason to change supervisors. And your supervisor is going to be fine. They're going to be fine.
And with that note, we'll probably leave it there. But Annie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate your expertise and insights. And Annie, if listeners want to find out more about you or get in touch, where can they find you?
So we have a Facebook group called the Provisional Psychologist Network that you can join. It's a closed group. Make sure to answer the entry questions or we will deny you. You can also find us on the website at www.provisionalpsychologistnetwork.com. And we've also got an online school, but you can find more information about that on the website.
Fantastic. Again, thank you so much, Annie.
Thank you.
Catch your listeners, and thank you for listening. See ya.